Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about tackling unseen poetry by looking at a poem I really love. It's Billy Collins's amazing poem, An Introduction to Poetry. So I want these podcasts to help you to develop as readers of poetry, and the hope is that I'm inviting you to submit an essay in response to this recording today, and I'll mark whatever gets sent to me, and my feedback will inform what I tackle when I look at the next poem. So I'm sure you're familiar with the asks of the exam already, but just to recap what you're being asked to do, in the poetry section you'll have 45 minutes. For the unseen element, there will be 56 marks available overall. The first question will be an analysis of an unseen poem. That's what we're looking at today. It will be worth 24 marks, and you should aim to spend roughly 35 minutes on it. The next question will be a comparison of that poem to a new poem. There will be 8 marks available, and you should aim to spend roughly 10 minutes on it. So, it goes without saying that this isn't the environment you would choose to encounter a new poem in. And I think to look at 2 poems in 45 minutes is an incredibly challenging ask. But what's important when you're approaching this section is that you avoid panic. And I know that's easier said than done, but this section is really an exercise in patience, and it will always reward careful, attentive readers. So I'm about to move into my first reading of the poem with you. I've chosen a poem which I encountered for the first time very recently, and I thought it was really brilliant in ways that I hope will become clear as you listen. And as I read the poem, I'm hoping that you're somewhere cozy and you've got a hot drink ready and a blank copy of the poem in front of you. There's lots of amazing places to read poetry, and I don't think anyone is making an argument for an exam hall being one of them. As year 11s, you're really well trained in answering these sorts of questions. But when you're confronted with a text you've never seen before, and you know you just have to get through the question, you just have to get something down, it's really easy to panic and to start responding before you're ready. My hope is that if you do panic, you'll put your pen down, because you're not helping anything by writing through that panic. So my advice would be absolutely avoid writing anything down on that first reading. Whatever wonderful things you've got swirling around in your head will wait, they'll keep. And usually whatever idea you're forming will only get better through being left to ferment for a second. So put your pen down, take a couple of breaths, and remember encountering a text that you really liked for the first time. It might be a favourite book or an article you found interesting, and with any luck it might even be this poem. Remember reading a text you like, keep your pen down for at least the next minute, and read. So this is An Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it to the light like a colour slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Okay, so the question I'm asking you to respond to after listening to this poem is, in An Introduction to Poetry, how does Billy Collins present the experience of reading poetry? And if I was you, I might pause here and write some preliminary thoughts and ideas about the poem down. What does it make you think of? What words or images stand out to you? And what's your gut response? Okay? So, I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a colour slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So hopefully you've got some first impressions down now. In the next bit of this recording, I'm going to talk you through some of my responses to this poem, and you might disagree, and that might make a really brilliant essay. So keep a hold of your own thoughts as you're listening. So this poem discusses how we read poetry and how we teach poetry. What drew my attention immediately when responding to this poem was those last two stanzas. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. I think my intention in this poem was naturally drawn to that end line, partly the comedy of it, but also that absolute disappointment after all those lovely images of the ways the readers might interact with the text, that their response is to beat it with a hose, as if there's no other way of making meaning out of it. That full stop at the end of that line, they begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means, I think is really striking, because most of us have felt that about a poem, that is eluding us somehow, and that if we just try really hard, we can reach an answer that's really definitive. Like we've been confronted with a Rubik's Cube and we just need to shuffle it into the right order. What struck me also is how powerfully Collins is able to visualise those common myths about poetry, that it's hard, that it's trying to trick me, that we need to torture a confession out of it to find some golden nugget of meaning. I was drawn to the frustration Collins expresses so eloquently because I saw myself, both as an English student and as a teacher, trying to learn to be a better reader of poetry, trying to teach others the same. The tone of the poem is wry, it's humorous, the images border on the absurd, and that's part of how Collins prompts us to visualise ourselves as readers. There's this gap between each ias, those carefully constructed metaphors, and the creativity and the sensitivity he wants us to show, and the completely blunt way his readers attack the poem, tying it up with rope and torturing a confession out of it. I think this goes alongside the quite informal register Collins uses. The stanzas kind of arrive as reported speech. They sort of seem like memory of something he said to students. Everything is carefully laid out and very simply explained. And that is in complete contrast to the blunt reactions of the poem's imagined readers. It feels like however carefully Collins packages his ideas, he can't seem to dispel the idea that it's hiding something, that the poem has something to hide. The second thing I noticed when I was reading the poem is the progression of the kind of alternate visions of reading. So before he talks about the most common responses to poetry, Collins visualises a series of ways of interacting with the text. There's something, I think, kind of magical in the image of the colour slide. During the Romantic movement, John Keats wrote this line about what it means to unweave a rainbow, how science and knowing things can defeat the magic of them. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that thesis all the time, but I do think that the way Collins' students attack the poem completely defeats the magic of it. I don't think you get to see how a machine works if you smash it into tiny pieces in an effort to see the cogs. But that doesn't mean the process of approaching a poem with curiosity and openness is as straightforward as water skiing across the surface, waving at the author's name on the shore. I think this is a really beautiful, really elegant image, but sometimes there's hard graft involved in getting to grips with a poem, which I think is really brilliantly summarised with the metaphor, walk inside the poem's room and feel for the light switch. That image, unlike the image of the water ski, isn't elegant or graceful. It's fumbling around in the dark for a bit until you get to grips with your surroundings. It's kind of noticing the positioning of things, the feel of them, and using your observation to find the light, to kind of reach a sort of idea about a poem. When I was researching for this recording, I discovered that the poem is very often a core component of Americans' honours projects, so in the American education system. And there's an irony in some of the responses students have written, because some of them have indeed tied this poem to a chair and beaten it with a hose to find out what it really means. Before we finish, I'd like to talk for a minute about meaning. So there's a meaning triangle attached to this recording. and you might have seen it before. So the writer is in the left corner, the reader is in the right corner, and the meaning is at the top of the triangle. So you might also notice that most of what I've spoken about here is to do with my gut response as a teacher, with its ask and I say and I want at the start of those lines. I think it really invites that response. I have that shared experience with Collins. Teaching poetry is a huge part of what he's writing about here. But the point remains that the way we form meaning out of poems is intrinsically connected to the experience we bring to a text, our own sense of ourselves and our interests. It's natural that a lot of that gets lost in an exam. In a lot of ways, it's a really depersonalizing experience. But what's frustrating for me as a teacher and as a marker when I see student responses is that if I stood at the front of the room and I asked a candidate, so what do you think of the tone of this poem? Or what sort of feelings does Collins express here about the way people he teaches read poetry? I think I'd get a very different response to if I asked students to write me an essay about the poem. And I think that's understandable to some extent. It's something we hope for as teachers. It's really important that you use written English when you're writing essays, that there's a degree of formality and structure which you're not going to have when we're having a discussion in the classroom. But that doesn't mean that your response to the poem actually has to change substantially. The real value of the reading triangle is that the meaning that comes out of that interaction with the text, the act of reading the poem, is not possible without you. It's a conversation between you and that author, and what results is a unique response that no one else could have formed. And that doesn't mean that you're free to write whatever. So I've seen some truly disastrous essays where students try too hard to be original, to come up with something that no one else will have said. But that's not going to work. If you force a reading, if you fail to bring your interpretation back to what is actually on the page, then you're inevitably going to land yourself in muddy waters. What I mean, then, when I say that there is an interpretation that is unique to you, is that you have a responsibility to read the text carefully and to trust yourself and your gut response as an intelligent reader of literature. Remember also that you can't expect to understand everything about the poem within the time frame you have, or to write about everything you observe. The examiners know that, and to a certain extent, they're always going to reward your interpretation, as long as it is evidenced within the text. So if you do nothing else with this question, you absolutely must remember to bring every single point you make back to the words on the page. There are boxes that you need to tick in an exam room, you know that. You need to answer the question. You need to write with a degree of formality. You need to talk about the writer's methods, to show off what you know about language and form and rhythm and whatever else strikes you as important. But amongst all that, it's still possible to write as yourselves, and that is what the best candidates will do. So I'm really excited to read your responses to what you've heard and to the poem. Make sure you send them to me.